The Holy Gospel according to Mark. Jesus and the disciples went on and passed through Galilee. He did not want anyone to know it, for he was teaching his disciples, saying to them, "The Son of Man is to be betrayed into human hands, and they will kill him. And 3 days after being killed, he will rise again." But they did not understand what he was saying and were afraid to ask him. Then they came to Capernaum, and when he was in the house, he asked them, "What were you arguing about on the way?" But they were silent, for on the way they had argued with one another who was the greatest. He sat down, called the 12, and said to them, "Whoever wants to be first must be last of all and servant of all." Then he took a little child and put it among them, and taking it in his arms, he said to them, "Whoever welcomes one such child in my name welcomes me. And whoever welcomes me welcomes not me, but the one who sent me." The Gospel of the Lord. Praise to you, O Christ. What are the stories you make up in your head? The scenarios you find yourself playing out, the one where some sort of situation is playing out in front of you and you begin to imagine yourself as a main player in that scenario. Something like turmoil in election year. Dark horse candidate Phil Hartwig leaps forward to become frontrunner in U.S. presidential election. Or Amazon founder Jeff Bezos unexpectedly retires. Todd Carrico named successor. What will Carrico do with Amazon? Or even placing yourself somewhere a little bit more fantastical, thinking, what would I have done if I was at Hogwarts with Harry Potter? I won't tell you my most common daydreams, but when Chipper Jones retired and there was an opening at third base for the Atlanta Braves. In today's gospel lesson, we see the disciples get a little too carried away envisioning themselves in one of these scenarios, the triumphant return of Jesus. I mean, can you picture it? Jesus is walking, leading the way towards Capernaum, and at what they think is a safe distance behind him, the 12 are huddled around each other, arguing in a stage whisper. "Did you see me cast out that demon? That's power. But how about the way I fed that group of people? Surely God's power is greatest with me." I imagine Jesus smiling knowingly to himself as he overhears them, decides to wait and let their argument play out, and then confront them once they've reached their destination. So innocently, he must have asked them once they're around the table, "What were y'all talking about back on the road? Sounded like a pretty intense conversation. I would love to know." Silence. The disciples know that Jesus knew, and they were embarrassed. But can you blame them? Just before this argument happened, he told them something they didn't understand at all. In verse 31, Jesus had told them he was going to be betrayed by one of them, executed, and then 3 days later he would rise again. This is the second time in the Gospel of Mark that he's told them this, and they are still trying to figure out exactly what he means. How could he be the Messiah and die? Surely greatness doesn't lead to death. So instead of trying to figure that out with Jesus, they stay silent while he tells them this, probably crossing their arms, nodding sagely to each other. And then once they think Jesus is out of earshot, they begin discussing exactly what role they will play in Jesus' messiahship. And from that scenario, they quickly devolve into arguing which of them is the greatest. Arguing who's going to lead the way into this new era of God's kingdom on earth, right next to Jesus. Seem like something that can happen to us as well? envisioning ourselves in new, more significant, more powerful roles. We seem to start off well when we think about that. But then something always gets in the way of our noble ideals. Before you try and distance yourself too much from this scenario, saying, that would never be me, let's look to Hollywood. The movies we connect with the most, they often reveal more about us than we care to admit, and though they may be a little overly dramatized, they speak to truths that we can relate to. Anakin Skywalker started out with the best of intentions. He wants to do two things, right? Rid the Republic of the corruption he believes to see, and save the life of the one he loves. But through the subtle manipulatings of Chancellor Palpatine, what started out as noble and perhaps even admirable ambitions turned him into a monster who would stop at nothing to achieve his ends. Instead of accepting the things he couldn't understand through Jedi knowledge, he tried to fill in those gaps with his own ambitions. And well, we know how that turns out. You and I may never have a chance to rule the galaxy, but how about something a little closer to home? I could do such a better job than my boss. A common sentiment, right? But what happens when that boss does get fired and we find ourselves actually in their shoes? How long do our noble ideals last? Perhaps we find ourselves mired in the same problems that they did and we swore we'd never get tangled up in. Or even worse, does that new promotion offer us a way to push forward our own agenda? And what starts out as the envisioning of a brighter future ends up perhaps with us as willing participants, perhaps reluctantly coerced into going along with it. It ends up becoming a way to increase our own or someone else's personal power and greatness. And we find ourselves having the same argument as the disciples. If we as humans can't seem to get it right, if we never seem to be able to follow through with the noble ambitions we start out with, how does God invite us to then rethink our idea of greatness? For the disciples, this comes with a strange twist. As they're relaxing, probably about to eat dinner at the house in Capernaum that they're staying at, Jesus teaches them a pointed object lesson on greatness. Apparently their host has children because Jesus just picks one up and holds it in his arms. Now today we would applaud that, whispering to each other, he's really great with children. What a great dad he'd make. Is your niece still single? But in his day, the disciples were probably startled and possibly even offended by that. See, children were the least valuable members of society. They would have been considered a burden, not a blessing. They ate valuable food and didn't really provide anything in return until you could start to get them to work when they were teenagers. So this child would have been the least likely person to command the attention of the one that the disciples believed was going to save the world. And this child, Jesus says, this one who is least in your eyes, this is the one you have to respect if you want to respect me. This is the one who will be the greatest in the kingdom of heaven. And with those simple words, I'm sure this nice image that 12 men had of 12 crowns on their heads and 12 thrones, and them leading the way into the kingdom of heaven, that image was shattered. The way to greatness in God's kingdom, turns out, was not one in which 12 men argue amongst themselves who has the most power. The kingdom of God is one in which those without a voice, those who are normally trampled on by society, those who society distrusts, those are the ones who have the highest value, who are the greatest in the kingdom of God. For Jesus and his disciples, it was a child. Who are those people for us today? Who are the people, when you construct your daydreamy scenarios where you find greatness, who are the people that are not there? Is it the man with the hungry eyes looking out at you from a heavy hood because his job has been lost? Is it the woman who speaks her reality only to be ripped apart by society because she's interfering with a man's journey towards greatness? Is it the child who speaks who they are on the inside, and that doesn't match up with the image you see when you look at them? These are the first in the kingdom of God. These are the ones we need to welcome if we're looking to welcome Christ into our lives. These are the ones who never find themselves in my visions of greatness. And yet, at the same time, they're the ones I constantly find God pushing me towards, pushing me closer to as he lifts them and holds them in his arms. Who is it for you?